All right, this lecture comes in two parts. It's called The Song of the Sea and the Subversion of Canaanite Mythology. If you don't know what the Song of the Sea is, Exodus 15, 1b to 18. And we'll be looking at that specifically in the second half of the lecture. But I want to show how Israel's literature engages some of the Canaanite mythology and perhaps even is influenced by it. Now, when we start talking about Canaanite mythology, one of the primary sources that we have of that, of what the Canaanites would have believed, came from the discoveries that were made at Ras Shamra, which is up on the coast of the Mediterranean north of Israel. It was discovered in 1928, and what it was discovered at Ras Shamra was the ancient port city of Ugarit, which was a significant place during the late Bronze era and was destroyed in around 1200 BC. And fortunately, in the case of this archaeological discovery, it was actually the tablets were discovered here. In other words, there was an archive, and so a bunch of important documents were there. This is where the ancient language of Ugaritic comes from. This was the language that was used at the city of Ugarit. It was an alphabetic script. It used the ancient cuneiform script, but used it as an alphabetic and phonetic instead of simply syllabic like some of the other languages had used. And the texts that were found there were both religious and economic, but none was probably has been studied more than the account of Baal or Baal. And the Baal Cycle, there were 6 tablets that were found. They were broken, and these have been reconstructed together. There's some blanks and some broken pieces where we don't exactly know what it says, but you can look up the story of Baal. If you want to go to Baal's website, baal.com, you can read an English translation of that, or you can find it in books such as The Context of Scripture or Ancient Near Eastern Texts. But anyway, the Baal story tells the rise of Bales, or tells a story of Baal's rise to prominence. And here's a picture of Baal, and notice the iconography here. Notice this right hand raised up. This is a classic ancient Near Eastern position of power and authority, and oftentimes in the Bible you'll hear talk about the Lord's right hand. This is that kind of a picture. A warrior or a king with his raised right hand as a show of strength. Notice in his left hand, it looks like a broomstick. This could be what would be called an Asherah pole, or some kind of representation of the goddess Asherah. And of course, he has the horned hat, which is a sign of divinity. Anyway, the Baal story tells the rise of Baal's elevation to being one of the chief gods. Up until that time, the chief god was El, and this is related to the Hebrew word El for God, but El was the Canaanite creation god. And El, as you can see in this picture, was portrayed essentially as kind of an old man upstairs. And if you think of that picture of God as being a happy grandfather sort of sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch looking down at creation, that's the god El. He's a transcendent deity, but there wasn't much interaction with the created world. And so so Baal was going to fill that particular role. And here's what happens in Baal's story. Baal, or what we have is it's the gods. The gods are in conflict over supremacy, and it should be gods plural, not God apostrophe s. So in this story, it's gods clashing for see who's going to be the supreme deity. And in the initial battle, Baal fights a god named Yam. Now, this isn't the god of the sweet potato, so don't worry about that. Yam is related to the Hebrew word yam, which means sea. So Yam was the sea god, or if you know the Greco-Roman deities, this would be Poseidon or Neptune. And so Yam rises up to take on Baal. And Yam's titles were Prince Sea and Judge River. And Yam, this first conflict represents a conflict over the status of creation, because Yam, as the sea god, was a god of chaos. And so this initial conflict was going to settle one of those big questions that everybody has about life, which is the creation secure? because chaos and watery chaos threatens to undo everything that had taken place there. And so Baal rises up to meet this first challenge, and he's aided by a kind of a demigod, if you will, by the name of Kothar Wahhasis. This is the craftsman of the gods. And Kothar fashions Baal weapons, and Baal is then able to slay Yam and establish order. Creation secure. Yam is killed, and Yam with his dying breath says, Baalim Yamlok, which means Baal will reign. Just remember that phrase, Baal will reign. So after that, after this initial conflict, Baal does what every good, self-respecting chief god does. He builds himself a house up on his holy mountain. His mountain is called Mount Zaphon. Now, if you know your scriptures, have a look at Psalm 48:2. Look at a couple English translations, because some of them try to hide this. Zaphon is also a word that can just mean north, but Mount Zaphon was the title of Baal's holy mountain. Look at Psalm 48:2. It's equating Zion with Zaphon. In other words, it's saying Mount Zaphon is the holy mountain of the true God. It's not Mount Zaphon where Baal and other deities live. And then there's a second conflict. What's the other great fear? If you're afraid that creation isn't secure, that's one thing. But most people also fear death. And the second great conflict that Baal has to fight is with the god of death, Mot. If you know the Hebrew, that's the Hebrew word for death. And the issue here is security of the future. Everyone's afraid of dying, afraid of death. So the deities fight. But this time something terrible happens. Mot kills Baal. And this sends Mount Zaphon into a panic as the other deities are upset. And so what happens, interestingly enough, is what? Baal is raised up. He returns to life. If you know the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone, you'll already know this story. But Baal returns to life. And so this represents, Baal is essentially a fertility deity. He's the god of the storms. So when Baal dies, that represents all the seasons of winter and fall. And then when he's raised up every year, that's the harvest season again. So the Baal's story shows his rise to prominence, and also explains why part of the year the earth lies dried up. So that